Be careful not to cut yourself on the fragments of silicon.
All right, welcome to another installment of the Fragments of Silicon, usually European interviews, but this time we got somebody from North America. Anyway, joining us today is Adrian Marple of, Obversion the game. The Steam page has you listed as like the publisher and the developer of the game. So,
yeah, I mean that's right. So, I mean, if anything, you could say if I'm forced to put a company, I put MarpleBot, which is kind of a gamer tag, but just a sole proprietorship, if you will.
Right. So we'll just list the game here. Anyway, so how we like to get started is like to get to know the person behind the game, the studio, whatnot, and we do that by asking them what got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level.
So I'd say on a personal level, I don't have quite the classic story of like, oh, I played video games when I was 10 and I completely fell in love. I knew forevermore that was my end all be all. I think it was just kind of a slow burn for me that it was just something that a medium that I felt enriched my life, much like reading. And I think it professionally, just over time, I've been doing various artistic side projects.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was looking to move on from my position at Google, which is where I was, it kind of just hit me in kind of a slow, over a couple of weeks way that video games was a really good medium for me because I had a lot of the requisite skills of programming and it was very visual, very scalable. I mean, and in general, I had really started to enjoy indie games mostly, and there's kind of much more auteur experiences. And on top of that, I mean, for Obversion, there's kind of I feel like there's a bit of a hole with these first-person puzzle games.
Mm-hmm.
That there's only a handful of really good ones, and so that definitely interested me.
And I suppose we should also touch upon your artistic background because it seems to be a big part of Obversion here.
Yeah. So, I mean, by training, I'm really hardcore CS and math. I started and got most of the way through a CS PhD at Stanford. And that's actually, I think, when my artistic side started to flourish more. I'd done a lot of side projects in undergrad, but in PhD or during my PhD is when I started to kind of experiment a lot more. I was doing a fair bit of kind of mathematical art, if you will. One of the earlier things I did was just a rendering of a logistic fractal, which I could try to describe with words, but it's one of those things that's a little easier to look up. But then another early artistic thing I did was, this was all in MATLAB for bizarre reasons that I guess that's just what I was using at the time. I made a genetic algorithm where I was the fitness function, just me evaluating, and it was just a bunch of filters that I applied to an image, and this was not even using the GPU because I didn't really know about that at the time. And I turned that into a calendar for my family. But like, I did some interesting, bizarre stuff during my PhD. So I started doing like chainmail inlays. At least I call them inlays. I don't know if there's a standard term for them, where I would make a chainmail pattern or a pattern in chainmail, basically pixel art. And then I would put that in a frame with fishing line, and like the very large kind of masterpiece that I like to think of took me an entire summer. Was interning in Boston at Microsoft Research. And that was of one of my genetic algorithm images from that calendar, actually. And yeah, that was 2 to the 16 rings. It's about 65,000. That took a long time.
Uh-huh.
And so yeah, a little later, I did a bunch of other stuff where I got into 3D printing, and that really let me explore a lot of geometric art. I had a colleague at the startup that I was at that really encouraged me to explore some like lighting ideas that I ended up having. Creating this one really nice piece that I made it's like nicely mitered brass pieces that form, I'll just say the technical thing, which is a Hamiltonian cycle on a dodecahedron, but it's just this really nice looking path that follows the edges of a dodecahedron.
And how did all this, flow into Obversion here? Like, what is the artistic thesis of this game?
So the main thesis of the game, and it actually the original name of the game is Duality.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like the visuals, and actually the one main reason I changed the name from Duality to Obversion was that I was overly stuck to this black and white aesthetic I initially was trying to pull off. And I just kept getting the feedback like it's too gray, it like doesn't really pop enough. I'm like, okay, I'll switch artistic styles. But Duality was always kind of the core that I was kind of the lodestone, if you will, or North Star, as they like to say in Silicon Valley startup is buzzword-filled. And like the core mechanics of the game, you have creation and destruction, which are separate. And you've got interactable and non-interactable blocks. Or if you want to be a little more poetic, dead and alive. And you have the special collectibles, which are just yin-yangs, which pretty much the symbol I started with from the very beginning and stuck with throughout. And then for the actual game, or I should say for the, if you take a screenshot and you ask about what those aesthetics, that was more me just kind of playing around with shaders and like feeling out what I, felt like a cohesive experience, and was a little more visually striking. And beyond that, I had one principle that I followed, which is that everything that's white should be important.
Mm-hmm.
So it can have, moving colors and stuff, and that might be a little distracting, but mostly it's just interesting. And then to just be like really clear to the player, like this thing is important. All the menus are in white. Excuse me. Yeah, so that kind of dictated some of the art to make sure that I didn't use white that much anywhere else.
Mm.
So kind of like a color black duality a little bit there.
Now, what exactly is the duality being represented here? Is it, like the traditional yin-yang, good-evil dichotomy, or is it something else?
It definitely incorporates that. I mean, it's not good evil. Certainly not as judgmental as that.
Mm-hmm.
I started, and you see some leftovers of there's a certain mathematical dual notions that I wanted to represent. So when I started, actually the very core, the first duality is the duality between a cube and an octahedron, which is definitely not the kind of Eastern Taoist duality. It's a completely mathematical, like geometrical notion that I've kind of been obsessed with. Platonic solids, and there's something called Archimedean solids that are like a slight generalization of that.
Mm-hmm.
But within platonic solids, your D&D dice, everything has a dual, which is another platonic solid. So a tetrahedron actually is self-dual. And then you've got a cube and an octahedron, which are dual. And the way you can envision the dual is that you just take the face of an object, convert that into a point, a vertex, and then join the vertices based on where the faces touched. And then if you can imagine doing that on a cube, you get an octahedron. And if you do this to an octahedron again, you get a cube back, and that's why they're duals.
Yeah, it's either make a point at the center of each face and connect those, or make each point the center of a face.
Right. I mean, there's a couple other relations and ones I actually use in the game. So a similar one is if you imagine truncating the corner, and you keep doing that until you get another simple shape, you will get the dual.
Until the truncations meet.
Yeah. And that's actually, so when you destroy a cube in Obversion, that's exactly what the animation is that the cube starts truncating from the corners, and then for a split, 100 milliseconds at the end is an octahedron when you're done. And the original destruction figure in the game was just an octahedron. So you picked up creation cubes and destruction octahedron. And I decided basically when I just changed it to the principle where everything was white, because it used to be white and black, and then I abandoned the pure black and white aesthetic and decided to make both destruction and creation pickups white. The silhouette for the octahedron is not sufficiently different from a cube. So I switched to something called a stellated octahedron, which is basically, if you imagine an octahedron and then you stick triangular pyramids on each triangular face, you get a very spiky version of an octahedron.
And is this this duality is strictly mathematical?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure you could come up with slightly strained metaphors that kind of bridge.
Yeah. It's just a bit unusual to get this kind of duality game. Like, usually when we are talking about duality in most mediums, it's not about geometry or math. It's it is about like good or evil, light and darkness, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are other. I mean, this is really just my math background, like seeping out in every aspect. Because I definitely think of this form of duality. I mean, there's other people wouldn't necessarily call it dual relationships. They might say it's like an inverse or something, but I think of like negation or inverting the colors of something is also kind of, it is a dual operation in that if you perform it a second time, you get back the original thing. And in mathematics, that's anytime you see something that's called a dual, it usually obeys that property. So the game has a decent number of that. Like in the second world, there's negative pickups, and the third world especially has the added mechanic where you switch creation and destruction, and that's very much a dual operation.
Right.
And to me, I find that sort of just philosophically, it's interesting to think about. You have these objects, but there's a third object that is the dual relationship between the objects. And it's much more abstract.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the game itself, is there any sort of narrative framing device? Like, who are you? Why are you converting these cubes into octahedrons? And
in that sense, there's not. It's purely abstract. There's a very, very light narrative arc where there's some quotes you can encounter. And I try to choose the quotes in a very light kind of narrative arc from world to world.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I just let it, sit in its abstract glory. Because I mean, the artistic style is relatively abstract, and I like to think abstractly. I feel like abstraction of that form in puzzle games is very well tolerated, and sometimes trying to shoehorn narrative is met rather poorly in puzzle games.
I suppose it depends on the context.
Yeah, absolutely.
I definitely get where you're coming from in regards to your own game here.
Yes. No, it's not something like, if I had made a completely different type of game, I would have done a heavier narrative for sure.
Right. And do the other colors have any sort of meaning? Like the gold blocks here, those are just the shaders?
Yeah.
Yeah. And let me see here. So how many worlds? How long is this game?
So there are 4 worlds. Each world has 7 levels. And there's a technical reason that I did that. And so that's 28 levels total. I estimate for some players it might take like 4 hours to get through without getting all of the collectible yin-yangs, maybe 5. And probably about 10 to actually collect all the yin-yangs, maybe a little more if you get stuck.
Right.
Yeah, and by the way, the technical reason that there's 7 levels per world is just the thing I did with the audio. Is every time you enter every world has kind of 3 musical lines other than the bass line that's always playing. I should say the more ostinato. It's not bass in that it's low pitch. So there's 3 lines, and I do all possible permutations of those 3 except none of them. So and there's 7 possible ways to do that. So,
all right. And now, is the whole cube octahedron motif throughout all of the worlds, or do each of the worlds have their distinct mathematical construct?
No, each of the worlds is mechanically and abstractly pretty much identical, except there's small added mechanics each time.
It's just the dodecahedrons.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. One thing I've thought about doing weird different geometries, and that's actually kind of before I settled on cubes. I was thinking like, oh, what if I do kind of more interesting geometry? Really, in the end, like, there's a reason people do cubes so much. It's because the lattice of cubes is just such a nice, tight construct. And like, if you try to do anything else, like, I think the only other one that I've ever thought of that I think might be coherent is hexagonal prisms. But no, for this game, it's all cubes, and then the cubes will destruct down to octahedron.
Okay.
And then the visuals change dramatically, and it doesn't have any particular meaning other than to just be a nice visual payoff and let me just explore different ways to express myself with shaders, really.
I see. And let me see here. Was this game? How long have you been working on Obversion here?
I started in September of 2018. I guess technically I started a little bit early in August, but I was still working, so I'll act like I started in September.
So about a year and a half?
Yeah, you could say that.
And did you do everything yourself?
Mm-hmm. It's 100% myself. Like the only thing, besides playtesting and asking people advice and all that. So I'm not going to act like it was completely, entirely in a bubble, like Ivory Tower, interacting with no one.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I did all the code, all the design, the shader artwork, the music.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's about as close as as a sole development as you can get. With a game this complex, I think. Like,
yeah.
Like there are games that are simpler affairs that really are man or one woman, one person, but it's like most games are not an island to themselves.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely. I mean, I think the only ones that come to mind are kind of like Lucas Pope type, because
right,
almost all of that himself. Other than voice acting for Obversion, he didn't do all that himself, obviously.
Yeah. Anyway, so was the game developed in Unity or Unreal?
Yep.
Unity. Not a surprise there. Did you find Unity to be a good choice for your game?
I think it was in the end. I think not really knowing the counterfactual of what it would have been like to do Unreal, I'm guessing it was a little easier to learn. There certainly seems to be more online resources, which is one of the main criterion I went with when choosing what to use. The other one was that I knew it would port to basically everything.
Mm-hmm.
If I chose to do more than PC, and by PC I include Mac and Linux as that, because they're technically personal computers. People don't like to call them PCs. And then I think I just took like one course to get the ball rolling. I'm usually pretty extreme autodidact where I don't really like, or I just kind of pick things up on my own. Certainly like C# was not an issue. I've changed programming language so many times. It just felt like, another variant on the C++ world.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, definitely it took me about 5 or 6 months to really dig into shaders, and that was super eye-opening and nice. And I think one of the things that's nice about Unity is that it doesn't try to go or push you towards the photorealism route that I feel like Unreal is kind of default good at. And since I think I end up literally every shader is custom in the game in the end. That was just like, it was not intentional from the start. It's just one by one I started wanting something slightly different than the default shader, and once I got used to doing custom shaders, it just kind of got on a roll, and no particular thing was that hard.
I see.
So yeah, in the end, I think Unity was a pretty good choice.
Yeah. And let me see here. In terms of shaders, what was it about them that you found so eye-opening?
I think it's I had been doing a fair amount of like pixel manipulation stuff in the past. So I think really going back to when I mentioned those kind of genetic algorithm images I made, that was all pixel manipulation that had I known about shaders and that sort of thing, I would have done with shaders, and it would have rendered instantly instead of taking like a minute because I was using the CPU. And it's just like I had taken a computer graphics class back in undergrad, so like I understood the lighting models already and kind of what was going on. It just felt I felt a lot more powerful even than normal as a programmer. I'm like, oh, this is a great way to access the GPU. Like I can do kind of crazy things. Well, in my mind felt a little crazy compared because I had been kind of putting constraints on myself before, and I don't know, it's just I really like doing that particular form of low level stuff. And it's highly geometric, and I've been messing around with geometry. So I think in the end it just fits so nicely in what I've been doing before. And it was just a lot more powerful than I guess I hadn't given that much thought, and it gave me a lot more power than I realized I had.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's good. And is this game going to be available for all three computer platforms? Just a Windows build?
Nope, it's going to be available for all three: Windows, Mac, and Linux.
That's good. That's good. And getting around to the title itself, you mentioned you changed it from Duality to Obversion. Exactly, what does Obversion mean in context of the game? Like, why was this a better title for the game as opposed to Duality?
Yeah, so, I mean, I was searching for a name that, to me, meant a very similar thing to Duality, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but was kind of more obscure, and therefore people could just kind of read into the name what they felt like. It's also kind of nice as it is an English word, and there's something nice to me about games with single obscure English words. But the word itself, it means a couple things. I think the first definition you encounter is something like it's a thing in logic where you take a statement like all humans are mortal, and then you can transform that to an equivalent statement, which is no humans are immortal. So I like to think of that as like the application of De Morgan's law to quantifiers, but I think very few people know what that string of words actually means. I think the more useful and obscure definition is so coins have like the very technical nomenclature for coins is that they have an obverse and a reverse side. So obverse is heads basically, and reverse is tails. So an obversion can be thought of as just turning a coin over from the obverse to the reverse or the reverse to the obverse. But in general, like both these things together, to me, obversion is it's kind of like, you could think of it as inversion. It's just another one of these dual relationships, or a dual operation where if you apply it twice, you get the same thing back. And so to me, it kind of represents that kind of third thing to point to. It's like you have these two things, but you also have the relationship between them. And it's all about that, the relationship between two duals and kind of transcending the duals themselves.
Well, knowing what you're going for, I can see why you picked it. Yeah. And let me see here. The music. Did you create the music to Obversion as well, or
Yep.
No? Okay. And how was that done?
It was interesting. So I mentioned that I kind of had a mini artistic flourishing in my PhD, and one of the things I pursued, I'll back up a little bit. So I played trumpet for like 12 years, I think. Eventually put it down after undergrad, mostly because the time it took to practice, especially the style of trumpet that I was playing, because I like to play high notes. It's almost like the weightlifting of trumpet playing, which is kind of a weird analogy, but it's fairly apt where if you stop practicing, you're not able to perform very well. It's not only like, your fingers don't know what to do. It's just like your lip muscles actually atrophy. Anyway, so I had been kind of like missing a musical outlet. So I spent a little over a year, maybe a year and a half, just kind of composing in my PhD, just for no particular purpose. I naturally gravitated towards more video game music. I tended to write more stuff that felt very like boss music-y, kind of oppressive. I don't even think dark is the right word, but I'd say oppressive, kind of dissonant. I like to listen to a lot of Russian composers, so I know there's a lot of influence there. So when it came to writing Obversion, like I knew I wanted more ambient, like non-obtrusive, and that's not quite my natural style. So I spent about a month just toying on the piano, just seeing if anything that I played felt like it might fit. I took about a month to land on something. And honestly, one of the base things was it's almost lame how simple it is.
Mm-hmm.
Where I was literally just I took my two index fingers and I was just like hitting a note, like a high note and a low note in, the technical term was a Dorian, so just starting on D. And I'm like, well, this actually just really works well as an ambient background. And so that's the entire background that I used. And then part of it was I just settled on like, oh, this is just a nice mode, the Dorian mode. But on top of that, I came up with a little more overall structure for the music of the game where it actually drops a mode, so it gets a little flatter and kind of darker, or at least less upbeat, every world. And then I just came up with partially I was listening to some YouTube stuff, and I landed on some stuff describing the music in Breath of the Wild. And Breath of the Wild, like part of it is they did some techniques to break the feeling of looped music by one of the things was by adding a ton of space between lines or between times when you hear things. So that was one of the things I did. And then the other technique they did is it's kind of like phase shifting randomly or feeling random. And that when you do that, you just can't predict exactly when the music is going to play something. And when you can't predict it, you don't feel like you're in a loop nearly as much. So I was just really inspired by that. So some of the music I wrote kind of had that phase shifting, and some of it just has just a lot of space between, and then just kind of like nice open chords, little single lines. Actually, I mentioned there's 3 optional lines. Each optional line has the same form in every world, where one is kind of more chords, just like 1 to 3 chords. One is just a kind of a little melodic line that's very brief, and the other is kind of an ostinato, just a constant line that has this phase shifting going on all the time.
And in terms of the music's relation to the game, is the connection just purely mathematical?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, that one's one of the slightly weaker connections, where it's kind of like, well, it's either off or on. I guess that's one of the main dual. The title music has actually really tight dual relation. where there's about 3 duels going on, even though it's a very short line. And that one was interesting, where I was playing with like how much I could do that, and it just felt like a really nice line. So it's basically in that one, it took some like notions from fugues, where there's 2 lines, and they're both playing the same thing, except one inverts. So when the other one goes up, the second one goes down instead by the same interval. And it's also what's called augmented, so it takes twice as long to play. And so you get this kind of nice interplay. And I just made sure that the notes work, and it sounded nice. And that's just the simple opening line that one does like it'll feel like it loops pretty quickly, but hopefully most people don't just sit in the title screen forever.
And so do you feel like you've gotten the requisite amount of artistic mathematical expression out of Obversion, or do you have more ideas that might be applied to a sequel, or something along the lines of Obversion?
No, I would say I got it out of my system for this one. I mean, not that I'm not going to have more mathematical and similar abstract concepts in future games, but as far as the really exploring the dual relationship and just the artistic and mathematical ideas of this game, I feel pretty satisfied. I didn't feel like I left stuff on the table, or if there were things, they got cut for very good reasons and like nicely principled reasons.
Fair enough. And how much is the game going to cost when it comes out?
So it's going to retail for $9.99.
Okay. And I suppose my final question is, do you have plans to port this game to like mobile devices or any of the consoles?
I have no current plans. That's always been a kind of a wait and see thing for me. I kind of, as a first game, I definitely wanted to make sure scope didn't get out of hand. And I feel like it's a very natural thing for indies to, you start in one place and then expand. You maybe get a couple news cycles out of it. I've definitely had quite a few people encourage me to consider VR for the game, which is not out of the question as well.
I could definitely see this becoming a VR game. Not this game, not this specifically because of how VR works, but a VR version of Obversion.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll see if my colleagues here have any further questions for you at this point in time.
I think all mine have been answered.
Yeah, I'm pretty good. It looks interesting, though.
Thanks.
Anyway, the game is Obversion. It's currently slated to be released January 28th, which is in 4 days, this Tuesday. Yep. So be sure to pick it up when it. Is it getting released like at midnight or midday?
Midday. So it should be released. At least what I think I put in Steam was noon Pacific time on the 28th.
All right then. All right. So that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. As always, be sure to tune in on Sunday for our typical review session. And until then, I shall wish you good games.